From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And coming up for you today, K-State's Dan O'Brien will remark on the market reaction to yesterday's USDA crop production and grain stocks reports, and to the suggestions that China may be back in the market for U.S. soybeans during Dan's weekly segment on the grain market trends. Then Britton Rucker has more comments for us from that United Nations Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock International Forum taking place this week at K-State. She'll draw from a panel discussion on the role of trade in sustainable livestock systems. And later on, we'll get together once more with K-State's Mary Knapp to talk Kansas agricultural weather. All this and more straight ahead on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today. Once more, thanks for listening in. Well, it was an interesting day for the grain markets yesterday, and we'll cover what was going on, of course, with Dan O'Brien aboard once again. Dan is a grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. He's along with us from his office in Colby, northwest Kansas. And we'll begin in a sensible way with those USDA crop production and supply and demand reports out yesterday. And Dan, generally well received the numbers as the trade absorbed them.
Yes. Decent corn closed up about 7 1/4 cents up to 3.67 1/4. November beans up 29 cents to 8.95 1/2. Decent hard red winter wheat futures closed up 5 cents to get back up over $4 to 4.03 1/2. And with all the pessimism we'd seen, particularly in the corn market over the last several weeks, wheat as well, you wondered if after all the down that we'd had, that if we had almost anything that wasn't extremely confirming of humongous crops, especially for corn, if we'd have an up in the market, and it ended up that we did. I think that there are underlying aspects of the crop production report in terms of ear weights and pounds per ear that provide some underlying support for sentiments in the corn market. In the soybean market, you have some underlying issues of the weight of pods and number of pods that, again, in both those cases, going forward, you can see that trends as we move from September to final reports, that history of late is that we could very likely see, in a normal year, we'd expect to see some movement towards less pounds coming out of the field.
Yeah. In other words, there are great doubts yet about those crops finishing.
Yes, and when you look at corn percent dented, we're about 2 to 3 weeks late, depending on which set of years, going back to 2015 that you're looking at. At a minimum, we're about 1.5 weeks later. And it's hard to know exactly, given all the reports that we have, and that, again, given some moisture of late, what we have out in the field looks really good. So the question almost isn't where we stand. Gosh, we wish we looked this good 2 weeks ago. and we're at these points now that we look good, but we're sitting in mid-September almost, and haven't had any threats of cool weather coming down from the north yet, but there certainly are concerns about crop maturity still to be dealt with. And for corn, in the notes that we put out each week, if a person gets into that, goes on to Ag Manager and finds that, you can look at our calculations for basically Macon County, Illinois, in that region of where corn would stand if it's planted basically in May 20th versus June 1st versus June 10th. And June 10th is when a fair amount of that corn was planted. Another case in point on where we stand in terms of crop maturity prospects before killing frost from a east central Illinois location, a southern Minnesota location, and also a southeast South Dakota location. And, unless farmers that had to plant after June 1st, on or after June 1st, were able to secure short season, 90-day corn, there's a lot of risk out there and uncertainty in terms of where this crop will finish up. And I think the market is generally cognizant of that. On the soybean side, whereas we said corn's about 2 weeks late, almost as bad, not maybe instead of 2 weeks, maybe a week and a half or so, but still very, very similar concerns for soybeans. And we talked a little bit earlier about how pod weight versus number of pods were at risk. Right now, the USDA's projections are for as low a pod weight as we've seen back going several years. As low as number of pods. Pod weight still projected to be high, but the trend as we go forward tends to be for those projections to go lower. So again, we've got issues of concern that are underlying the yield and production numbers for corn and concerns underlying the production numbers for soybeans. I should also mention, Eric, that the USDA in this last report unveiled a tool that they're using to measure the normalized, something they call the NDVI index, Normalized Difference Vegetation Index.
This is, in essence, a vegetative map?
It's a vegetative map, basically showing in a normal year where we would start to see maturity and drying down of these crops. Well, whereas in the last several years, we would have started to see this downturn 2 or 3 weeks ago. Well, we're just barely starting to begin it right now. So not trying to drum up issues in the market, but as long as we have good growing weather, probably we'll just go on our merry way and not be greatly concerned about any of these issues. But we're in September. Give us 1 or 2 weeks, start to have forecasts of any cold weather that might be coming down. And, given what we're seeing for corn and soybeans on these index analyses figures, I would be sure that the market would pay attention to that. I guess we shall see.
Also yesterday, an infusion of good vibes, if you will, especially for the soybean trade, as the word was getting around that China may have purchased a fairly significant amount of soybeans, and perhaps aligned with that, a thawing of this long-standing trade dispute.
I couldn't say it any better. Those are the two main factors that were in people's minds. Again, it's supported by some of these underlying concerns for soybean production numbers as we go forward. Again, positive talk. The markets, I think they look at these things, and again, the combination of all this yesterday caused upfront November 2019 soybeans to jump up 29 cents in one day. So a great thing if you're a seller. So I think with this type of positioning and activity coming into the next round of negotiations, and the fact that both countries, from what we read, are concerned about the potential of their economies slowing down. At least there's a lot of talk of that in the U.S. From what objective sources we can get out of China, they also have those concerns. So with all that in mind, you find support now for the soybean market. Really interesting to see. Still wonder about 367, 368 corn, given the uncertainties that are still out there. And we're definitely taking a show-me Missouri attitude towards any supply issues with the U.S. corn crop. And as is well documented, there are a number of questions that have to be answered and issues that have to be unwound before we get to the November and January crop production reports to give us a final base for which then we can figure out how much corn we're going to use and what our stocks are likely to be, and the price to adjust to ration whatever we have. So the September report is really just setting the table, I think, for the findings that we have to get at in the October, November, and January reports.
As for the wheat trade, well, this USDA September suite of reports very rarely would issue something that would resonate to any degree with the wheat trade. However, the department did yesterday drop its wheat price projection And you point out that has relevance to our producers out there who'll soon be making a decision on farm program, price support, participation, and which direction they would go there.
Gosh, what a funny world when we get excited when the USDA drops its wheat price.
Right.
But by doing that, again, farmers are making choices on PFC versus ARC County in a lot of cases. And by dropping from $5 to $4.80 for this projected year marketing average price for 2019-20 marketing year started June 1, they've increased the projected PLC payment by 20 cents. Again, they measure that payment by how many cents you are below the 550 reference price. So here, that price had been $5, as we'd been talking about at the Farm Bill meetings the last 2 or 3 weeks. And now, here we have the September report, they dropped to 20 cents. Well, all those calculations that we were looking at that were 50-cent PLC payment, well, now suddenly they add 20 cents to it. Now it's a 70-cent payment. Not all is bad on the wheat side. You know, there are ongoing, lingering issues in Australia, still unanswered questions about parts of the Black Sea region in terms of wheat. Maybe the biggest number is that the world ending stocks figure just keeps climbing and inching its way up. So if there are any problems, they haven't expressed themselves in terms of the overall aggregate world wheat trade yet. And for the U.S. price to really jump up, you probably have to have something like that happen.
Dan brought it up. His notes on the grain trades have very comprehensive numbers and charts and graphs on the USDA reports yesterday and the other information that's pertinent to the markets, and that is posted, as he mentioned, on the agmanager.info website. Have a look at agmanager.info. Dan, we appreciate the input. Many thanks.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
He is along with us each Friday to get into the grain market scene. Dan O'Brien, grain market economist with K-State Research and Extension. You are listening to Agriculture Today. After the break, Britton Rucker will check in. She'll have more comments that were expressed at that International Forum on Sustainable Livestock Systems, which was put on by the United Nations here on the K-State campus this week. Stay with us for that. This is the K-State Radio Network.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. I'm Britton Rucker. Once more, we're sharing just a few of the remarks and exchanges of ideas that have been taking place this week during the United Nations Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock International meeting on the K-State campus. Once again, more than 300 scientists from 22 countries around the world checked in to discuss a broad spectrum of topics relating to livestock production sustainability. Tuesday afternoon, a panel discussion was conducted on the role of trade and innovations in a sustainable livestock system. 5 panel members were asked to respond to 5 questions. Under that banner, we've selected 1 question, and you'll hear the panel's responses. The panel included President of the U.S. Dairy Export Council and former U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, Vice Minister of Livestock in Paraguay, Marcelo Gonzales, China Association of Animal Science and Veterinary Medicine, Ma Chaung, World Organization for Animal Health, or the IOE, Phillipe Dop, and U.S. Department of Agriculture Foreign Agricultural Service, Jason Hafemeister. The question to them: increasingly, consumers all over the planet care more and are paying more attention to where their food comes from. Governments will react to this demand in trade negotiations. Does this build in motivation for sustainability? And further, has this fundamentally changed the nature of trade and or sustainability conversation? In order of response, Tom Vilsack, former U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, stated government has a role in creating the rules of the road and to help producers respond to circumstances.
I think it's fair to say that consumers are indeed more interested in knowing where their food comes from and how it's being produced. Unfortunately, I think that many times consumers are misinformed. So I think in terms of government's role and in terms of trade, I think first and foremost the government has to sort of establish the rules of the road. And I think first and foremost governments have to recognize that indeed the climate is changing and it is going to have an impact on how we produce, where we produce, what we produce, and how much we produce. And from that, I think a lot of policies are formulated. I think government has a responsibility of making sure that in addition to discussing this in trade, that it equips its producers to be able to respond to the challenge of sustainability. And that means creating systems and structures that invest and incent the kind of activity that will allow us to be more resilient, allow us to adapt and mitigate to the consequences of a changing climate, and as a result be more sustainable. I think the government also has a responsibility, in addition to the food safety aspect that every government has, ensuring their citizens that the food they consume is safe, that there is a source and a method by which consumers can go, or a place that they can go to get trusted information. Oftentimes, I don't think government really understands all of its responsibilities in terms of providing the information that would allow consumers to be able to make the right choice. Because as consumers are making these choices, that in turn is going to dictate how you negotiate a particular trade agreement, because you're going to try to respond to the needs of your consumers. It would probably help if just today, if the five of us could agree on what sustainability actually means. We might find that there are 5 different definitions of that, and that's part of the problem. We define this differently depending upon our circumstances. If we have a common definition, if we have informed consumers, if we have the right policies incenting the right type of activity, then the ability to enter into trade agreements that reinforce sustainability become a bit easier. But if we have different definitions, if we have different expectations and acknowledgement of the challenges of a changing climate, if we have different government programs that incent certain activities but not consistently, and if we don't provide consumers accurate information, then I think it becomes really, really hard for government to do what it needs to do in this space.
That was former U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack. Vice Minister of Paraguay, Marcelo Gonzales, points out through an interpreter that sustainability looks different in different countries, and it should go hand in hand with negotiation.
Every
time that consumers choose a product, they're interested in knowing where is that product coming from, who produced that product, and how it was produced. And that's why certain countries can differentiate themselves from other countries, because they have a better approach, because the government was able to recognize that situation.
Entonces, digamos que en esa parte de la sostenibilidad
and that's why sustainability should have different approaches too. So different factors that we need to consider. We need to consider the economic factor, the social factor, and the environmental factor.
From Paraguay, that was Marcelo Gonzales. Next up, Ma Chaung, China Association of Animal Science and Veterinary Medicine, concurred with Vilsack on government should have a role to promote sustainability practices.
The built-in motivation, I think, is really will help to improve the sustainability. And I think the public concern should be encouraged by the government. And the government should keep the commitment to the consumers to provide the quality, the safety, the environmental friendly, and the safety food from the system. But I don't agree the government overuse this public concern as the barrier to block the normal trade, to eventually to protect the domestic industry. I think the government should advocate the concept of sustainability and implement some related measures on practice in the domestic industry.
That was Ma Chaung from China. Phillipe Dop with World Organization for Animal Health brings forth that science is part of the solution, but science is not always easy for people to understand.
From the OIE perspective, I have to say that it is legitimate and useful to know the origin of the products. In our domain, we call it the traceability of the products. And it's very important to avoid the dissemination of some transboundary diseases. But traceability is a very important point to be efficient when it comes to animal diseases control. But what I would like to add is that it's very important, and my colleague said it, to build consensus on the standards you want to have as a reference at a global and international level. We have two solutions. We can multiply the private standards and to have a kind of jungle of private standards, or we can work together within international organizations to build strong international standards, science-based international standards. Science is very important as a reference. Having a strong science-based reference standards bring legitimate standards. For example, for trade agreements.
From the World Organization for Animal Health, that was Phillipe Dop. Lastly, comments from Jason Hafemeister with the U.S. Department of Agriculture Foreign Agricultural Service offers trade is essential to sustainable outcomes and competition is good.
I think, first of all, we need to recognize that trade is fundamental to achieving sustainability, environmental sustainability in particular, because trade at its very core is about competition, and allowing competition gives us the chance to increase productivity, efficiency, specialization. It allows land-extensive, temperate climate countries to produce more that can feed places that would be much less efficient and much dirtier in their production, for example. So we need trade if we are going to really have sustainable outcomes. But at its core, what competition brings is two sides to a coin. On the one side, competition encourages investment and innovation and increases productivity, results in greater wealth, which leads to resources that we can then use to promote virtues like sustainability that allows people to achieve their personal aspirations of a better life. So that's the good part about competition. It generates wealth. But on the flip side is that we're worried that competition can also lead people to make bad choices, that people will cut corners, they'll cut costs, they'll cheat at the marketplace, they'll ignore standards. So while we need trade, what we really worry about is how we manage that trade, what institutions exist so that we can promote the virtuous activity that can lead to real sustainable outcomes, but guard against unfairness. I don't think that you're going to have a sustainable political solution if we try and cram standards down people's throats. So when we set up institutions for trade, we need to set them up so they promote that kind of competition, where consumers can speak with their dollar and say, this is what I value, I'm willing to pay that extra margin to get it.
From the U.S. Department of Agriculture, that was Jason Hafemeister. Just a sampling of comments made by the panel during a session on the role of trade and innovations in a sustainable livestock system during the UN Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock Conference this week on the Kansas State University campus. When we return, Eric will have the agricultural news headlines and more. I'm Britton Rucker, and this has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University. This is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And now today's agricultural news headlines for you. These courtesy in part of DTN. Thought we'd pass along the Kansas numbers from that USDA crop production report released yesterday morning. These based on September the 1st conditions now. Kansas 2019 corn production is forecast by the USDA at a record 816 million bushels. That would be up 27% from last year's production. To be harvested for grain, 6 million acres, up 20% from a year ago. And the corn yield in Kansas forecast at 136 bushels per acre, up 7 bushels from last year. Grain sorghum production in Kansas forecast at 197 million bushels. That would be down 16% from last year. To be harvested, 2.4 million acres, down 9% from last year. And the sorghum yield at 82 bushels per acre, down 6 bushels from last year. In Kansas, soybean production is forecast at 200 million bushels. That's down 2% from last year. The area for harvest at 4.5 million acres, 3% below that of 2018. And the soybean yield forecast at 44 bushels per acre. That would be up a half a bushel from last year, according to the USDA. Both China and the U.S. are confirming that there will be working level or deputy level talks between the two countries next week. That came in the wake of President Trump announcing earlier in the week that he would delay for 2 weeks a tariff rate increase on $250 billion worth of Chinese goods ahead of the upcoming trade negotiations. China's Commerce Ministry welcomed the postponement and said Chinese companies had started making price inquiries for U.S. agricultural goods, including soybeans and pork, although there were no details on the timing or the size of any intended purchases. Beijing suspended purchases of the U.S. products, as you know, back in August. Ministry spokesman Zhao Feng said that the possible resumption of agricultural products imported is not a bargaining chip in trade talks, with top-level talks hoped for early in October. Those are expected before October the 15th, which would open the door to a further postponement of higher U.S. tariffs. Meantime, support for the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement seems to be gathering momentum, as we hear from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
Outside the U.S. Capitol Thursday, a rally of agricultural interests all asking for
the USMCA soon as possible.
Former Arkansas Senator Blanche Lincoln acting as host for the rally, which included members of Congress and others. House Ag Committee Chairman Colin Peterson told the crowd several lawmakers have told him that the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement could come up for a vote in the House in 1 or 2 months.
I know the Speaker is working hard to build support in our caucus so that we can bring this to the floor. So I think we're on track, at least at this point.
On hand at the rally, former Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack, now heading up the U.S. Dairy Export Council. He said the USMCA is a very important agreement. Important
to 2.5 million farmers and their families, to the 43 million hardworking Americans whose jobs depend on the food and agriculture industry, and to the 320 million consumers who want choice, who want quality, who want safety, and who want competition for their consuming dollars.
In Washington, Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
And rollback of the Waters of the U.S., or WOTUS rule, was finalized by the EPA and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers yesterday. The Obama-era WOTUS rule expanded the Clean Water Act jurisdiction to cover over 60% of the bodies of water across the country. The rollback will narrow the scope of the CWA back to the 1986 standards in place before the regulation in 2015, while the EPA continues to work on the new update to the rule. Well, the 2019 Kansas State Fair is entering its final weekend in Hutchinson. A number of wheat-based competitions have concluded there, and the end results can be viewed while attending the fair today through Sunday. Jordan Hildebrand has more on this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Jordan?
It takes a lot of work to get the glowing Ferris wheel spinning, just like it takes a lot of work to set up the ye old mill, grooming competition livestock, making the thousands of funnel cakes and cheese curds, and keeping the fairgrounds a clean environment for families to enjoy. But most people don't think about the countless hours and dedication it takes to produce the stunning entries that you see at the Kansas State Fair. The fair shuts down the fryers and closes down the buildings on September 14th, so make sure that your family heads there soon to have some fun. Between the rides and attending concerts, be sure to head to the competition buildings to take in the work that your fellow Kansans have put into their entries. Kansas Wheat sponsors several contests at the fair, including the wheat photography in the Oz Gallery, bread sculpting in the domestic arts, and the Wheat Variety Plot 4-H Award in the Education Building. The 2019 Kansas 4-H Wheat Variety Plot Display winners were announced in the Showcase Building during the Kansas State Fair in Hutchinson. Participants plant and raise 5 varieties of wheat, and then create an educational display to showcase their wheat production and accomplishments. This year's winner was Jacob Bell of Hugoton, with Maddie Nishpour of Ness City, Ryan Myers of Minneapolis, and Truman Hooker of the Goodland area, rounding out 2nd, 3rd, and 4th places, respectively. The bread sculpture contest was another resounding success, with Wilma Olds of Wilson taking home the champion prize. Her creation featured a carousel crafted entirely out of bread and icing that even turned like its real-life inspiration. Participants' keen eyes for beauty were put on full display in the wheat photography contest. From the tiny miracles of newly emerged wheat to picturesque views of local elevators, these contestants documented the full reality of wheat's life cycle and made it beautiful art. This year's top winner was Scott Weimeyer of Cheney. Kansas Wheat also hosted a special tribute to the wheat industry in the Pride of Kansas building during the entirety of the Kansas State Fair. This year's booth celebrated the National Festival of Breads, which is sponsored biennially by the Kansas Wheat Commission, King Arthur Flour, and Red Star Yeast. The Kansas Wheat booth showcased the success of the June 2019 event, which included a Kansas farm tour for the 8 contestant finalists from all around the nation, baking workshops and demonstrations, bread sculpture displays, and much more. More than 3,500 people from at least 29 states and 5 countries attended the event that highlights Kansas wheat and the farmers that produce it. The Kansas Wheat booth, located in the Pride of Kansas building, would not have been possible without the hard work of the Speak for Wheat spokespersons and the Kansas Wheat commissioners. These hardworking individuals worked at both the Kansas Wheat booth as well as Agriland, the educational area sponsored in part by Kansas Wheat. Another thanks goes to the Wamego FCCLA chapter, who also volunteered at the Agriland exhibit, helped to share the story of food with the thousands of families that came through the experience. For Kansas Wheat, this is Jordan Hildebrand.
Thanks, Jordan. And weather-wise, it is a spectacular day for state fairgoers today. We'll have a look at the forecast with K-State's Mary Knapp next on Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions. Coming your way now on Agriculture Today, our weekly glance at Kansas agricultural weather. And once more welcoming in Mary Knapp, climatologist, K-State Research and Extension, who's been preoccupied a fair part of this week, Mary, you tell us, with a special event here on the K-State campus. Thought we might let folks in on that. Something called the Kansas Climate Service Summit. What was that about?
Well, basically what we were trying to do is get together various groups across the state as well as regionally and nationally that provide climate information and coordinate that with users of that information so that we could improve the availability and especially the understanding of the needs of those users of climate information so it could be better incorporated in decision-making across the state. So we had people from the national level, the Climate Prediction Center. We also had the climate focal points from all of the National Weather Service offices that have responsibility in Kansas. We had a representative from Iowa and also from the Pueblo Weather Service, regional climate services, including the High Plains Regional Climate Center. So again, a wide-reaching group of those that provide climate information, but then across the various agencies and non-governmental organizations that utilize that climate information and getting them together in the same room to kind of talk about how we can improve that accessibility.
And those users included agricultural interests.
Oh, yes. We had the agricultural interests. KDA was there. We had the Farm Service Agency there, as well as the Risk Management Agency. There were conflicts. This is a very busy time of the year, so not everybody that we invited was able to make it. But we're hoping that from this we will be able to launch additional efforts to connect, again, the users of climate information with those that make that information available.
So before we move ahead, what's the next big thing in climate information availability?
One of the things that the climate community is focusing on is improving that midterm outlook reliability. So the Weather Service does a wonderful job doing the weekly forecasts, and then we move to the Climate Prediction Center for that 6 to 10, 8 to 14 day. Now they're trying to improve the products for the 3-week, 4-week time frame, so that would be out to a month, in addition to enhancements of those seasonal outlooks that we talk about on a regular basis here. So again, we're looking forward to seeing how those might have improved, and again, their utility for those that are making decisions on those climate impacts and how climate affects their activities.
Always advancing in this area. That's great to hear. Now, to this past week, we had rain in Kansas, well scattered, welcome in some places, not so much in others.
Right. And we, as we've noted in the past, look at the week ending on Tuesday to provide information for the U.S. Drought Monitor. When we look at that particular time period, which covers September 4th through September 10th, we only had 2 divisions that were wetter than normal. That was the Northwest and the West Central. They were about 1.25 times what they normally would see, and that averaged right around 1/2 inch for each of those divisions. Very welcome moisture for them in preparing that surface soil moisture availability for the fall planting, whether it be winter wheat or canola or cover crops for that matter. So getting a little bit of that surface wetness there, but not so excessive that they're going to be locked out of the field for weeks. The opposite side, the southeast, actually had only 3% of their normal rainfall. They averaged 0.03 of an inch, which was very welcome for them. They've been locked out of the field for some places as much as 2 months. They've been 8 weeks without being able to get equipment into the field. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, as we move towards the end of this week, we had quite a bit of rainfall on Thursday. Mm-hmm. And those numbers are still coming in for the Friday reports. But a lot of areas in east central, southeastern Kansas saw 1 inch or more in their rainfall. And again, that's an area that does not need that extreme moisture. We're hoping for a little bit drier pattern to allow some of that field work to go. They've got corn that's ready to be harvested if it could dry down enough to be at harvest moisture, and if the fields would dry down enough so they could get in.
Well, the recent temperatures had to have helped in that dry down because it was quite warmer than normal, you say.
Right. We did have that good news on the temperature side. We averaged almost 6 degrees warmer than normal across the state. For the cool side, we were seeing lows in the mid-50s to upper 50s, which, again, is seasonal for this time of the year. Unfortunately, for many of the days, our lows were in the 60s and 70s, which contributed to that warmer than average, but, again, is indicative of that higher dew point, higher humidities, which also tend to slow down dry down.
So what is ahead for next week? Will we see accommodating conditions for helping those crops toward that finish line?
Well, it looks like we might be seeing some of that. The 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 day outlook both favor warmer than normal temperatures for that period. So we'll we'll take it, especially if it's more modestly warm and we don't have quite as much of those humid air masses in place. The 6 to 10 day precip outlook has a slight chance favoring wetter than normal conditions, but the 8 to 14 day is on the dry side. When we look at the quantitative precip forecast, that is showing more of a dry pattern, particularly in the western divisions. That period going through the 20th of September is calling for less than 1/100th of an inch in those western three divisions. Get closer to 1/10 of an inch as you move into the central divisions, and then you get into the east, we may see as much as 1/2 an inch.
Mary, thanks. As always, we'll welcome you back next Friday.
Thanks, Eric.
Mary Knapp, climatologist with K-State Research and Extension. Likewise, thanks to you for being along with us, and do enjoy your weekend upcoming. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.